Hello everybody, hope you can all hear me all right. If somebody could give me some sort of nod to let me know that I'm audible, that'd be brilliant, thank you. Fantastic, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm always just a bit worried about technical stuff. Hello, welcome to our latest webinar. Thank you very much for coming and joining. I'm delighted to introduce our panel for the evening. So you met Ben last time if you were here. If you weren't here last time, then you missed out. It was great. Ben, do you want to say hello and say who you are?
Hi, my name is Ben Campbell. I'm a clinical psychologist working in oncology in Liverpool. And as Will says, we kind of agreed to set this up. I think after a whole load of different discussions, just in supervision and different places. And the last event went really well. It was really good.
Thanks, Ben. So in a second, I will introduce our lovely panel for the evening, and you can hear about hear about who you're going to be speaking to and hearing from. What I just wanted to do first is just explain a bit about the structure for the evening, if that's okay. So as hopefully you're aware, these webinars we've set up really to provide a space, hopefully to think a little bit about class in relation to clinical psychology. So the folks that you're going to hear from tonight all work in clinical psychology, either as trainees or as qualified clinical psychologists, and all coming to chat a little bit about their own experiences, personally and professionally, about how they think being from a working class background kind of relates and ties into their role. I think I probably said something similar to this last time, but our aim for this isn't to provide anything other than a space. You know, we want to start the conversation about some of these issues and get people thinking about some of these things. So we hope that by sharing a bit about some of this stuff, that'll hopefully prompt useful conversations more broadly. So we'd really encourage you guys watching to join the discussion today via the chat, the discussion function on the Teams thingamajig, also to tweet using the hashtag #ClinPsych, and also to take it beyond tonight, you know, to go and talk to people at work, talk to friends, talk to family. Let's just keep these conversations going, however that feels useful. The plan as far as it goes for tonight, we have 4 speakers who are going to talk for about 15 minutes or so each. So the plan is that we're going to have 2 speakers both talking for 15 minutes each, and then we'll stop, take some questions from the audience. Then we'll have a bit of a break, get a chance to get a brew and have a breather, then come back and we'll have 2 more speakers, again both speaking for about 15 minutes each, and then take some questions, and then hopefully that'll give us a bit of time at the end to do a bit of a kind of Q&A with the whole panel. So please do chip in, use the discussion chat thingamajig along the side to contribute. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go along. So if you've got any questions, either directed at the person who's speaking, or if you've got broader questions or comments, then please write them in the discussion group, and we'll pick out some of those. We probably won't get a chance to answer everybody's, but we'll do our best. What else do I need to tell you? We would ask if you could keep your mic and your camera off. That would be really useful, just because with so many people in a big meeting, it can get quite noisy otherwise. So if you can make sure those are turned off all the way through, that'd be brilliant. But as I said, please do use the discussion, use Twitter, use the hashtag #ClassClinPsych. That'd be great. Just to mention as well, I'm recording the session, so if you do ask a question in the chat, that is part of the recording. So just be aware if your name is visible, that'll be going up on YouTube and be publicly available. All right. The other thing I'll say is to please just be nice to our panel. They're all kind of very nicely giving their time up for free, giving up a lovely sunny evening to come and talk to the likes of us. So it's really, really appreciated, especially Liam, who's jumped in at the last minute to help out. So please, you know, let's be kind of nice and compassionate to our panel. Let's ask them. Certainly, I don't mind asking challenging questions, but let's make sure that they're nice questions. I think we kind of really want to make sure this just feels like a good space for everybody who's here. Okay. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to ramble on about. So we've got a lovely panel who are going to talk to you. So first up is going to be Jade. Then we're going to hear from Elenia. Then we're going to have Emma, and finally Liam. So at this point, I will hand over to Jade, who's going to go first, and she can tell you a bit about, well, who she is, what she's there to talk about. Over to you, Jade.
Hi, I'm Jade Weston. I'm a clinical psychologist. I trained at the University of Hertfordshire and graduated in 2013. So in terms of my background, I come from a single parent working class family, although some might refer to it as kind of the underclass. So my mum kind of received benefits throughout the whole of my childhood, and for a time I spent some time in foster care as well as a child. So I'm care experience, which is a big part of my identity now, not so much growing up, but as a care experience clinical psychologist. So in terms of kind of going to university and studying in and of itself was a real novel experience. There was no one in my extended family who'd done that, and I've got a very big extended family. My mum is one of 12. So that was a different experience. I didn't really know what to expect. And in terms of clinical psychology as a profession, it wasn't something I was initially looking at that point. I was looking at investigative psychology, so forensic psychology. And then it was kind of at university I discovered that wasn't a real career, in terms of I wasn't going to be Clarice Starling talking to criminals in prison. So my first kind of in terms of jobs, my initial job from graduating was working in a youth offending service, so support work, and then I went on to be a research assistant in offender mental health. So that was really helpful because it helped me decide between research, forensic and clinical psychology. And then I went on to do a clinical assistant psychologist post in London, which was a real eye-opener in terms of kind of thinking about the background I came from.
Sorry, folks, it looks like Jade's frozen a second. Sometimes with Teams, it's worth just giving it a minute and seeing if it catches up with itself. So let's just stare at the frozen face of Jade. See if that helps. Aha, Jade, are you back with us?
Oh dear.
Sorry. Unless keeping very still and cut yourself off mid-sentence, you froze a bit there. Would you mind just backtracking a bit over what you were saying?
Yeah, no, the whole screen went off. It
Okay,
completely died. So I had a bit of a panic. So I was just saying, going from my experiences, being from Knowsley, studying in Liverpool, going to London, to Hampstead for my assistant psychologist post was like a completely different world. So working with psychologists and psychotherapists who thought that if you had a chippy tea on a Friday night, that was a sign of neglect, and real kind of snobbish attitudes. So that was really difficult, kind of being in an environment where people held those views, that people were kind of swanning around in their Gucci dresses, kind of looking down on the great unwashed. So that was a real experience. So I went on from there onto training, and I was really helped by another assistant psychologist who got onto training the year before, who was also from a working class background. So we found a real affinity, and she supported me with my application in terms of thinking about what courses look for and a way to kind of think about the benefits of my background and experience, and also to maybe clean up and smooth some of the edges of some of the more difficult bits. In terms of training, I don't feel like there was any particular barriers in terms of being from a working class background. I'd say, with the exception for me about it being a very middle class profession, and feeling like you kind of, in some ways, you compromise your identity. And I think through training and throughout my whole career, it's been a way to try and find a balance between the two, of trying to keep a foot in both camps in terms of where I come from and this profession that I'm in, So I feel
Sorry, Jade, you went off again there.
I know this is not going well at all. Yeah, so I don't know if it will be easier if I turn off my camera, just whether that will reduce the load.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
That might be worth doing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, just trying to kind of maintain a balance in terms of where I've come from and the profession that you're in. I think, and really kind of trying to figure out what kind of psychologist I wanted to be, because I think a lot of the role models in terms of the people who do the teaching, supervisors, you know, the kind of examples of clinical footage that you see are often of middle class professionals without, you know, without accents. And I think initially, you know, first placements, I was trying to be kind of like a middle class professional, dress in a particular way, talk in a certain way, almost, I don't know, kind of like where you put on a telephone voice, that kind of thing. So I think now being more comfortable in my skin as like a working class psychologist and kind of being more casual, and kind of more human, more myself. I think in terms of the advantages of my background, it's really useful in terms of my job. So I work in family safeguarding, which are social services. So there's a lot of, I guess, similarities between the client group that I work with and my own background, which really kind of helps in terms of that affinity and connection with clients, and also the level of understanding about being poverty aware, about having those kind of social references, about understanding what might be going on for them and what they might be prioritizing, and seeing some of the, I guess, what would be framed by some professionals as problems as a strength in their ways of trying to survive really difficult circumstances. And really, I guess, having a hopeful attitude about the potential for change, and the potential for growth in adversity. So there are some of the kind of things that I've held on to and that I'm able to bring into the clinical work, but also in terms of consultation and being able to critique the theory that I draw on, and kind of being socially and politically aware and thinking of therapy as being, thinking about our role as psychologists as being outside of the therapy room, that we need to kind of be activists also, and kind of campaign for change on bigger levels. So kind of bringing all aspects of my identity and my experiences with me rather than compartmentalizing those things off. There's probably more I could say, but I'm a bit fearful of the camera cutting out again. So I think I'll stop there at that point, and go back to you, Will.
Thank you, Jade. Do you know, we did so well at the last one with the technical stuff. It's completely like, yeah, it's completely unexpected that we would have some disaster. So thank you for thank you for sticking with it. Yeah, thank you, appreciate it. Okay, if people have got any questions or comments or anything for Jade, please do put them in the chat, and we'll come to those in a second. But next up, I'm going to hand over to Elena, who is going to talk a bit about some of her experiences.
Well, thank you, Will, and thank you, Jade, as well. It's really nice to hear some of your experiences, and I feel like I can relate to a lot of what you said there, so I'll try not to repeat too much. But yeah, so as Will said, my name's Elena. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist at King's. So I started in October, so only a few months into my first year, really. Although we've just finished our first year at the same time. So I guess in terms of context, so I just, before I talk about my experience more generally, I feel like context is always really important in these situations. And so I wanted to say a bit about, obviously I'm a white Welsh working class woman in the field of psychology. And so some of the barriers that I might talk about, or the things that I've been through, obviously I was from quite a ethnically homogenous area in the country. So some of these things might have been made worse if I wasn't a white woman and I didn't pass for being middle class if I dressed a certain way, or if I tried to tone down my accent or anything like that. So I guess it's just important to bear those things in mind, that there may be further barriers for people who are working class but not white, I guess. And as well, I just wanted to say briefly a bit about what working class means to me as well, because I think often it's kind of talked about. I know when I've mentioned it in lectures or in seminars and things, it's spoken about in terms of lack of finances or lack of an education. Things like that, lacking in some way, having a non-professional job, a non-career job. And I guess you can probably tell from how I'm talking about that, it's not really how I would see it. And I guess obviously there's elements of that to it. And my story is quite heavily impacted by finances and things like that. But I guess there's other things there as well. There's kind of value sets and things that, there's positive things that we draw upon as working class people that I think are really important to, keep as additions in our minds when we think about people who are working class, and not just that they're not privileged or they're not well educated or that they're not financially well off or things like that. I guess it's the additions that I'm wanting to hold in mind when I think about this. And so I guess, in terms of context, I don't want to go on about my upbringing too much, but I will say that I've lived kind of all over North Wales and have experienced things like homelessness, and have moved house about seven times during my school years, and have had periods of sleeping on the floor of family members' houses and things like that. So I think that kind of context is really helpful. And I've seen the kind of impact of precarious employment for my parents and things like that. That has probably influenced my decision to go into psychology. So as a child, education was really important to me. It was kind of a safe place where, I could do well and I could achieve, and I could get a lot of encouragement and reinforcement that I maybe wouldn't get in other places. And also it was kind of seen as a way out, I guess. You see all this struggle around you. You see, in these big council estates where there's not much going on, there's nothing being offered for people. And so you do kind of look for a way out. And I guess I was thinking a bit as well in terms of kind of social mobility and things like that, and how I really don't like this idea of social mobility, but at the same time I kind of buy into it, because it's that idea of, if you work hard enough, then you can leave the working classes behind, and you can aspire to be middle class, or you can get out of that kind of situation if you work hard enough, kind of pull yourself up from your bootstraps kind of mentality. And I really hate that idea, but at the same time, I feel like I've bought into that and done it myself. My mum was always saying, if you work really hard, there'll be better things out there. And I guess I really bought into that idea, but also the implication of that idea is that the people who I've kind of come from, the people in that working class with me who are not doing these kinds of careers, who didn't choose to go to university or weren't able to, it kind of makes it seem as though they have some kind of deficit, or they didn't work hard enough or anything like that. So I've got a kind of a double-edged sword idea about this term social mobility. And I guess just drawing on what Jade said about that foot in each camp as well. So, obviously going to university and choosing a career that's, trying to be a doctor. Wow, it's so impressive. But it kind of alienates you from all those people that you've come from. But at the same time, you don't feel you fit in with the people that you're now with, the people in your profession, or that are sat next to you in lecture theatres. And so you're in the university environment, you're feeling like you're working class and you don't belong here and all of those things. But then you go home and you're like, oh, well, do I really belong here anymore? And you're kind of in that kind of in between, foot in each camp, I think Jade said. I really liked that phrase. And just going back to context a little bit. So I originally wanted to do medicine, I think, but being homeless throughout your exam period doesn't make for good A-level results, as you can imagine. So had a bit of a change of plans and sat there for many nights Googling what career is going to pay me money to train, because it was really important to me to be financially stable and to have a kind of set career path that wasn't precarious like my parents' careers, where you'll be laid off from factories and things like that at a moment's notice. And so clinical psychology came up, and it really kind of struck with my values and things like that. So it just kind of worked, and I'm quite a determined person. So I went for it. I did everything I could to make sure that this would happen. And I think if we go back to those kind of positives about being working class, I know that it's one of those things I really hold on to, that the working classes are a determined people. We may not be a homogenous people, but we're very determined and very hardworking in my view. So so I decided on this, and I thought I've got to make this happen no matter what. So being Welsh, I was fortunate enough to have a lot of different grants and things available to me to get to university, but there were several different examples of times when things might have fallen through. So I was fortunate enough to get maintenance loans and grants and things, but they don't come in until your course starts, which is like 2 weeks after the course starts. And so to secure accommodation at Liverpool John Moores University, which is an amazing university, by the way, to secure my accommodation, they were asking for several £100 deposit. And I thought, how am I going to get this money? And that was another one of those times where I thought, well, am I going to be able to go to university now? Is this going to be another one of those pitfalls where, oh, well, I don't have £200 to pay this deposit. Nobody I know has £200 to spend on this. And so then the dream is over and I just don't go to university, and I find a regular job like everyone else. Fortunately, I think it was my dad's partner loaned me some money briefly. So I was able to move in, but there are all sorts of other little barriers, small things, like I couldn't move in at the same time as everyone else because my mum had to do a load of night shifts that weekend. And so I missed out on loads of the social things, which at the time you're like, oh, well, it's not that big a deal. But just these little things that I wonder if other people from other backgrounds maybe didn't have to consider as much. I don't know. And I guess, obviously being in university, having nobody in my family gone to university before, obviously a strange environment. I had, I was really strictly budgeting and working in the cinema part-time and all these different things, trying to make everything work, and not having a winter coat in Liverpool in October and having to wait until my loan came in before I could get one, and things like this that, just these little things that kind of mount up. And having my flatmate, for example, buy a flat screen TV with his loan, and then tell me how fortunate I was to have such a big amount of loans because I was Welsh, and because I wasn't financially very privileged, I guess. And he's, oh, you're so lucky you get so many loans and grants. And I was like, but you've just bought that TV. Is that the best use of your money? I don't know. But yeah, just a different world, I guess. And yeah, I didn't really, at university, at undergrad, I tried really, really hard. And I guess as well, this is part of that working class mentality of I'm never going to waste an opportunity. I've got this, I've risked a lot to get here, and I'm in a lot of debt already. I need to make this work. So I really worked hard and didn't really do anything else because I couldn't afford to do anything else. But so I managed to get myself a first, and I had a lot of lecturers tell me, oh, you should do a master's. You'd be really good to do a master's, and it would look great. You want to do clinical psychology, right? Go and do a master's. And I was like, it's that embarrassment again of having to say, I can't really afford to do that. And there's so many times having to say that. It's kind of like I've seen on Twitter people talking about being outed as working class. You can do everything that you can to maybe hide it sometimes because you're wanting to fit in with your surroundings. But I guess there's that element of sometimes you've got to say something. And yeah, that idea of being outed then, And I remember a lecturer telling me, oh, it's cheap in the Netherlands, go to the Netherlands, live there for a couple of years and do a master's there. And for a while, I got my hopes up about doing that and then realized it's just not possible at all. Yeah, but it was nice to dream for a while. And so obviously, I think a lot of people will be aware about the competitiveness of assistant psychologist jobs. And so when I was graduating, you know, I'd gotten my first and I thought, right, I'm going to get these jobs. And of course, that's not how it works. They're so hard to come by. And I didn't really have anywhere to live after university either. So I was very fortunate. I had my partner and his family kind of took me in and I lived there free of charge because I was all the way overdrawn, had no money to get to interviews, no money to buy interview clothes, and all these kind of barriers all the time. And I finally got an interview for a support worker job on the bank. And when I successfully got that interview, because somebody drove me very kindly, it turned out that they needed a research assistant, an assistant psychologist in a research team. And so the job quickly changed from being a support worker to actually, oh, do you want to take part in this research project? We know you've got a degree. And I was so excited by it. It was amazing. But then I had to go for a second interview. So again, poor partner's mother had to drive me and take me there. And one of the requirements was having a car. And I just said, yeah, I've got a car. And again, it's just this thing of I wouldn't have gotten that job if I didn't have a car. So I had to say I had a car, but I was all the way overdrawn and I didn't have access and all of these things. And just again, all these barriers all the time. And that thing of having to get yourself in debt all the time. But I guess I eventually made it work and I saved up and got a car. But, you know, there were times where, because I was employed through the bank, I didn't get paid for 2 months in that job, for example. And for other people, that might not have been such a problem. But I was, you know, just finished my degree. I'd used up all the overdraft available. I just had to buy a car for this job. And I was traveling around the area doing these research tasks. And I remember being stuck outside. I don't know if anyone knows the Mersey Tunnel in Liverpool, Birkenhead. I was stuck outside the Mersey Tunnel because I didn't have enough money to get across. And I couldn't go home. And I sat there for quite a while before I found enough 1s and 2p's to add up to I think it's £1.20 to get through. But just little things like that really add up. And I do wonder, do other people think about these things? Do other people have to weigh these things up so much? And I guess you're viewed as being, you know, professional. I was going into people's houses. I was wearing my best, you know, I had a blazer on and a clipboard and I had my first class degree, but I couldn't afford to get through. And I was driving this rusted old car that I couldn't change the gears on and things like that. So it's just this kind of, I guess, the seen and unseen about it as well. And just briefly as well, I know I'm talking quite a lot, but I have just got a few more things to say. In terms of applying for the doctorates, obviously I'm quite early in training and it's very daunting to not have any, you know, anyone that you know who's done an undergraduate degree, never mind progressed further than that. And so I guess there was a lot more at stake for me when I wanted to apply. There was a lot more like that view of, I really need this. If I go back to that social mobility example, I need this to get somewhere and to get me out of this situation and to, you know, to be more comfortable and to get this career that I need. So there's a bit more at stake there, as well as it being the dream, the professional dream. There's more at stake practically, I guess. And so when I was offered the place here at King's, it was my dream course and I was so excited, but I realised very quickly that I couldn't afford to move house all the way to London. And there was a lot of kind of tiptoeing about how am I going to navigate this? Where am I going to get this money from? And so I kind of asked the course and they said, well, there's student accommodation or there's NHS staff accommodation. But again, they still needed big deposits. And so in order to accept my place on the course, I've taken out a loan and things like that. And I just wonder, I don't know, those kind of unseen barriers, I guess. Like if I haven't chosen to take on more and more debt to progress in this career, would I be here? There's so many different points in my career path where I've thought if I hadn't have taken on more kind of personal burdens or more financial burdens, would I have gotten to this point? And so just really briefly to finish up, I'm aware of the time, but a few examples of when we've spoken about class in training, I've found it really interesting that it's one of those things that's not mentioned so much. And I'm aware there's a lot of things that aren't mentioned so much. We don't do enough talking about race or ability or any of the other social graces. But I guess class is ignored as well. And I think it's such an intersectional thing that we do need to be able to discuss this more. And I wonder, sometimes when I find an article in a newspaper or something that mentions the working classes, I find it so interesting to read it and find out, was this written by somebody who feels that they are working class? Because it's one of those professions that's very middle class, just like in psychology. And so there's a few times where I've mentioned about working classness, I guess, and lecturers have equated it like, oh, okay, you mean people who earn under a certain amount, or you mean the uneducated people, or you mean I don't know, people who haven't been to university or something like this. And I'm like, no, I mean working class people, and there's a huge spectrum of people that fall in that area. And just another example as well, when I've spoken about identity in some of our lectures as well, and I've mentioned about being working class as part of my identity. And we were asked to think about the stereotypes that we wanted to overcome that were associated with those parts of our identity. And I said, well, I'm working class and I'm not stupid. And people laughed. And I thought that was so interesting, because I truly, from the bottom of my heart, didn't mean it as a joke. It is one of those things that I thought that is important for middle class people to understand, is that there's so many barriers there, and sometimes a choice as well in terms of not pursuing a higher education. But there are so many barriers. And yeah, and as well, I've been told, oh, you can stop talking about class now, because you're middle class now. And I'm like, what? So as soon as I got on the course in October and I started earning this great wage, and I can afford to buy fancier clothes, and I live in London now, I'm suddenly middle class. I've been promoted and I should be really grateful, and all of those things. And it's just a really interesting thing about what makes us working class. And just to wrap up, I promise I'm nearly done, but in terms of the kind of the benefits, I just wanted to highlight, now that I'm finished, I'm aware I've missed off so many different things. I wrote way too many notes for this, but I think there's a definite determination in working class people. And as Jade said before me, we have that shared experience more. We don't just know it academically, what it's like to be in that situation, but we can feel it. It's not an academic exercise for me to talk to somebody about housing difficulties. I know it and I can feel it. And it might not be the same thing that they've experienced, but I can go to that place in myself as well. And I know that struggle, I guess. And I guess in terms of things that I would recommend for people as well, I think just read as much as you can about the kind of intersections of things, about race, about class, about gender, about ability, all of those social graces. I think that's really helped me a lot in being able to articulate a bit more. It's still a struggle, but just being able to articulate a bit more what my experience is and why that matters, I guess. And yeah, I think I've missed out so many things. But I think I'm ready to stop talking now. Thank you.
Thanks, Elenia. That's brilliant. I don't know if you've been keeping an eye on the chat. There's been some fantastic questions coming in, so thank you. Jade, are you around? Yeah, there she is.
Yeah.
I noticed you'd replied to one. Did you get anything in particular you wanted to say, having had a bit more time to read and digest than Elenia said?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really great questions. So there was one about how do you overcome stigma, and I guess it depends on what it is, but I guess it's
Oh no, I think we're going to miss out the wisdom on whatever Jade was going to say. Elenia, just while we're waiting for Jade's camera to catch up with itself, I just wanted to pick up with you about the point about driving, because I thought that was a really concrete example of, I think I think you used the phrase unseen barriers, which I think is exactly one of the things that I think is really important to think about. And having a car or having access to a car is there's so many things that go before that. Firstly, you have to pay to learn to drive, and then it's the cost of buying a car, it's the cost of maintaining a car, the cost of running it, insurance, petrol, things going wrong. And I don't know. I know it's a topic very close to my heart, having had a lot of cars that have died horrible deaths because they weren't very good to start with. A couple of people have commented on that about. Oh, hi Jade, welcome back.
Turning off video, so I don't keep getting kicked off.
Okay, we've moved on while we were waiting for you, but we'll come back to you in 2 ticks. All right. I lost my train of thought now. I just wondered, Elena, if you had thoughts about the kind of the challenges of being in that position of it not being an automatic thing to have a car. Do you know what I mean? And the kind of the emotional bits that go along with that.
Yeah, so I think you've highlighted some really important things there about so my siblings, I don't think my siblings, oh no, they do know how to drive now, but not one of us could learn to drive at the kind of at 17. Like everyone else in our high school seemed to just automatically, kind of parents pay for lessons, or they've got some savings that they can fall back on and pay for lessons, and then as soon as you pass, you get a car, and then that's it. You just keep on going. And so like with a lot of the things in my kind of history, it was when I finally had the money, I was working in the cinema and I was using all of that money to pay for driving lessons. I had one summer and I was like, I've got to pass this test. I cannot afford to take this test again. And I really believe in luck sometimes. Sometimes it just falls into place, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it was just really fortunate that I managed to cram in a load of lessons in one summer and pass a test with the lowest expense I could. But it is really frustrating. And the cars I would get would be, I'm really proud of myself for being able to find these old bangers that seem to last a year or so, or that I can make, drive and pass MOTs without maybe being functionally sound. But spending £400 on a car and being really proud that I've managed to pass a test and that I've been able to afford my own car, and then driving to my assistant psychologist job where all of the staff were privately educated and the patients were quite a middle class population as well. And having the staff comment like, oh, who's left that horrible car? It's blocking me in. Who's left that on the driveway? Oh, and it's got a steering wheel lock on it. Why would anyone steal that car? And I had to sit there and turn around and go, oh, that's my car. That's my pride and joy, that car. It represented so much graft and hard work for me. And to have those kind of comments and you just, water off a duck's back kind of thing. But yeah, I can't remember what the question is now. I'm sorry. I just gone off on a tangent.
You've answered a better question than what I think I asked you, so that's fine. I think a couple of people mentioned about some of the practical barriers as well in terms of jobs that require a driving license and access to a car. And I think that's just such a complicated issue, isn't it? Because there's going to be some jobs where it's not feasible to do it by public transport. If you're in a job where you're going out and about in the community, going to people's houses, you can't get around public transport. And I mean, I say public transport, even if that's still a real challenge for a lot of folks. That's not cheap, that's not easy. So it's a massive challenge. I think what I did just want to respond to somebody I think mentioned about the courses and their policies on having a driving license, and that's just a good thing to look into during the application process because every course has different rules. So some courses do require you to have a driving license and access to a car before you start the course. Some courses don't. It completely is up to the individual program. So if you, it's just something to do your research about when it comes to making your choices about which clinical psychology programs you wanting to go down. It's, as you can imagine, not always an easy position for a course to take, but some courses are geographically in places where they cover a very big geographical footprint. So it's tough. I have to share this though, if that's all right. I know I'm talking loads, but
I think I went over, so it's fine.
I'm going to put this quote in the chat, which is Terry Pratchett and if anyone's a Terry Pratchett fan, you'll recognise what I'm going to post immediately. This is Captain Samuel Vime's Boots Theory of Socioeconomic Unfairness. And I think if you read that, that just, for me, in my mind, applies perfectly to the challenges of running a car. Anyway, Jade, are you still with us?
Yes.
Hello. You were mid-sentence. You were just about to say something really eloquent and interesting about stigma, I think.
Oh, you set me up there. But yeah, I think about stigma. I think a big part of it can be the internalized stigma. So for me, I guess a real sense of shame about my background, and then on top of that, a sense of guilt about the shame. So I guess I was very selective in terms of sharing about my background, and it being quite a sore point in terms of worklessness, benefits, being in care, that sort of thing. And really going through a process of self-acceptance. And I get it's tricky because the guilt was also that I hold socialist perspectives, that that's not something to feel ashamed of, you know, being on benefits and or being in care. But at the same time, you kind of internalize those messages from society. It's hard to get away when you see it on the front of every newspaper. You're in a clinic and you hear professionals talk about, well, they're not going to be a good parent because of the experiences that they've had, and they kind of twist and use psychological theories to distort and apply to individuals in a stigmatizing way. And I think it's important in terms of managing that is to kind of use supervision. I think it's been helpful when I've been able to be proactive in sharing about my background and experience. So using things like genograms, which is kind of a way of mapping your family tree and your history and what you bring to the work. So bringing that to supervision, connecting with your peer group, like other trainees. And I was, you know, my course, HOT, that I was on was very kind of into thinking about diversity and personal values and things like that. So that was a really kind of helpful basis, that those were open conversations that we had. So I always kind of came from it from the position of that says more about the individual than it does about me. That's yours. You know, if you have those kind of views, that's on you. That's not on me. So it wasn't something I ever openly challenged because I didn't want to necessarily out myself, but it's something that I would kind of take and hold with me, and it would kind of give me, I would try and turn it into a strength of this is fueling my desire to influence the profession and the systems. This is the reason why I'm doing this, and this is why the profession needs people like me, so we can challenge these kind of views and have a more hopeful and diverse profession. So I think, yeah, all of those things as a way of kind of tackling stigma, I guess.
Thanks, Jade. Alenia, anything to add?
I think that was really good reflections. And yeah, I guess I always think about just reading as much as you can, and just having that bravery to talk about it openly. I think having those reflective spaces, and like Jade said, bringing it up in supervision. Yeah, and I guess one thing that does come to mind though is sometimes when I've brought it up in supervision, because often my supervisor is from a really middle class background and kind of makes the assumption that I am as well. Sometimes if they can't quite place my accent, or I don't know, maybe I haven't outed myself yet or something. Then sometimes I think they mistake it as if I want to self-disclose something. You know, if I mention in supervision that a client's had housing difficulties and it struck a chord with me, or they can't afford to travel to an appointment, and I'm like, gosh, I remember that, and I've tried to bring that up in supervision, and I think there's a misconception there that I would want to say to the client, like, I've been there and I know that, and make it about me somehow. And I guess that's not something that I would want to do, because it's obviously the session is for the client, but I think it's important to think about the feelings that come up separately in supervision, because I do wonder about obviously identifying as working class, but now being in quite a middle class environment, having this power, you know, as therapist and having clients come to you. So I think if I was then to say like, oh, I also identify as working class, then I don't know how that would come across. So I think there is that confusion there about sometimes if you bring it up in supervision, that it might be misconstrued as a desire to self-disclose and out yourself as working class to the client. Whereas I think the conversations can maybe be a bit more nuanced sometimes. But it is important to bring it up. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like, well, it is. It's like middle class is seen as the norm, and people don't go around identifying themselves as middle class. Like it's not needed, and people assume that you're middle class until kind of said otherwise. But it's a shame that, you know, supervisors are missing those opportunities when you bring up those issues about what it's like for a working class person and the barriers to access and therapy, that they don't take that then to reflect on maybe their service needs to be redesigned to meet those clients' needs.
Yeah.
Which, you know, if they're not able to listen to that and take it up, that's why it needs more of us in the profession. So if they're not going to listen to us, we're just going to have to do it ourselves and take up those leadership positions and, you know, fight the fight.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, one thing, one example I've just thought of when you were talking, Jade, was just about I've been in services where I've heard the phrase, oh, they're a lovely middle class family. They're a very nice middle class family. Oh, you'd love to work with this family. I saw this lovely middle class family for an assessment the other day. And I'm like, what does that imply when that language is used about those who aren't middle class? Who aren't we calling lovely in the room? And I think that's always something that I'm going to try more, I think, to question a bit when I hear that in an MDT.
Thank you. And I think I just add to what both of you said, and that I think for all of those reasons, I think that's why it is so important to increase diversity in the profession across all the different, in all the different ways possible, you know. And I think, yeah, I think you've hit on some of the reasons for that really, really nicely there. Can I just point to a particular question? Because I think I'm going to merge a couple of different questions, but I think there's an important point in there, kind of about how we talk about some of this stuff, maybe thinking about stigma and some of the barriers that we alluded to, but how we talk about some of this stuff in terms of applications and interviews. There was a comment earlier about how to do this but come across in the right way without it putting people on the defensive, without it being accusatory. I don't know if either of you got any thoughts on
that. It's interesting because, like, from my course, we talked about all the different aspects of diversity, and I'd say the most uncomfortable one was probably around class, actually. Having those conversations where I think it was because maybe people thought that for once, if they were like the middle class person, they were almost like the bad guy. So they felt uncomfortable maybe with those alliances. And I think that's what someone brought up, that if you mention about the profession being middle class, those middle class interviewers get offended. So I guess my advice would be, rather than to kind of say what you stand against, it's better to maybe position yourself as what you stand for. And rather than kind of coming across as an attack, maybe you need to think about what you can add, what your strengths are, what you bring, rather than what you want to take away from the profession. And then maybe it might be received a bit more. I mean, it's hard. You shouldn't have to adapt yourself for it to be more palatable to other people. But I guess that's the reality of the you know, the system that we work in, is that, you know, trying not to get people's backs up or being seen as kind of like a radical leftist working class kind of person who's going to dismantle the whole system. So yeah, I probably wouldn't talk in this way that I am now in an interview. Well, you know, maybe a little bit. So yeah, I think what you stand for and what you're going to bring, rather than an attack on what they don't do.
Yeah, I think in terms of the application process, I did end up commenting on it on my application form for the doctorate. I think there's a box at the bottom, or like right at the end, that says any other experiences that I can't remember the phrase, but it's something like any other experiences that might explain some anomalies or anything you think might be relevant, something like that. And I spoke in there, and I was quite frank because it's not a very long word count. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. So I think it was my second application. The first time I just skimmed and I didn't really use that box, and I had a lot of input from a supervisor. And the second time I thought, right, I'm just gonna say what I want to say and see what happens. Which I don't know whether I'd recommend or not. I'm not sure. But in that box then, I was just really frank, and I said, not in kind of a sob story kind of way. And I said, look, I've experienced X, Y, and Z, but I feel like it's made me, I don't know, more suited for this profession because, and then you can kind of say like you're more aware of social issues, you're more passionate about improving, improving services, improving access to services for a whole range of different people. Because you've got that experience yourself, and I think it's really helpful to bring that in. And I think in my interview as well, I think I was asked a question at my clinical interview about a time I'd worked with a client and what was good about it. And I did mention during that I was working in eating disorders, and it was quite a middle-class area, and the population that we saw was quite middle class. Despite the fact that the area is quite diverse, and I do wonder about access issues there as well, but it was quite unspoken. But there was a couple of working class patients who came through that, I don't know, we kind of struck a chord a bit more. And so I spoke about one of those as an example in my interview, and reflected on the ways, the similarities and the difference and the power dynamics and things like that. And so again, kind of gently outing myself in the interview, gently outing myself on the form, in ways that feel safe and contained as well. And like Jade said, not being, kind of full throttle about it, not being really like, I guess not pushing too much of an agenda, despite the fact that I will have an agenda, everyone does, but I guess just including it. And I think by us including it, then hopefully, the next lot of people who can apply will be encouraged to put those things in their forms, and then it won't be so weird to discuss these things in the future, and we'll all be a bit more self-reflective about our privileges and our disadvantages and how that affects us as psychologists. But I do think it's really important to include, basically. Yeah.
And just saying from a different experience of that is that I've rated some application forms, and I would encourage people to do it, both in that box about how they've been affected, so they can kind of take the contextual information into account when they're looking at the criteria, and some courses are actively seeking to do that. So there might be some changes afoot with the clearinghouse where they actively ask questions like, were you eligible for free school meals? Did you have a parent who was on benefits? Are you the first in the family to go to university? Were you in care? Did you care for a parent? Or because they want to look at that information when taking account of, did you achieve what you could have? Or, is your achievement outstanding in comparison to your baseline? So I would mirror what you're saying there, but also integrating it into the rest of your application in terms of seeing it as a strength and an asset about, bringing a different perspective to the profession, and that benefit in the profession, but also the other trainees on your cohort, that you can have much richer conversations and learning experiences as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always keen to position these conversations as not being a kind of us versus them kind of thing, because even if somebody, grew up in Buckingham Palace, no one chooses where they grew up, do they? No, we only know what we know from our experiences, and I think it's really important to be able to talk about difference in that non-blaming, non-judgmental way. Thank you both very much. I'm going to let you take a breath, and we will have a bit of a break. So it's just coming up to 8 o'clock. Shall we take just sort of 10 minutes or so? So we'll get started again at about 8:10. Give you guys a chance to just go and get a cup of tea, catch your breath, and then we'll come back together for about 10 past, and then we'll hear from our other two speakers. Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, we're just going to jump back in a wee second, so I might get Liam and Emma to pop back on if possible. Hi guys. First of all, thank you so much to Jade and Elenia for sharing their experiences. I think it's really interesting for me because there's some reflections that I have just from my own experiences, but I think also from the last webinar we had. And I think definitely some of the things that Elenia talked about in terms of finances, I think that was something that came up quite a bit in the last discussion that we had. And I think some of us, me, spoke quite a lot just about the relationship with debt, you know, like having to kind of, or feeling that you have to just keep pursuing and keep jumping over these hurdles, sometimes no matter what the cost, literally, you know, and having to pursue funding or pursue loans or whatever in order to get through the career. And I think that's a really, really useful point, and it's interesting that it's come up again in the discussion this evening. People are having really lovely discussions kind of in the chat to the right, so please continue to do that, and any questions you want to ask, just keep kind of chipping those in. It's really, really helpful. I think something as well that Jade had talked about was that kind of internalized shame and stigma, and I think that was kind of personally one of my kind of worries that about doing something like this was, you know, how much of this is our own kind of shit that we're, you know, chatting about, and how much of it is, you know, throughout kind of the profession or whatever. And actually through having these discussions, it's been really reassuring in a way to see that there are so many commonalities in our experiences, regardless of kind of geographically where we're from, or, you know, by what way you've identified as being from working class backgrounds. Was really, really interesting. And I think Jade shared something just about kind of the messages, the kind of implicit messages that come through training sometimes. And Emma will remember this, like we had some teaching on like childhood development when we were on training, and the person taking the training talked about like the milestones that kids needed to reach, you know, like at what age do you go to the shop by yourself, at what age can you make a cup of tea by yourself. And I think that was the point that a few of us realized that maybe we had been neglected as children, because we'd been making cups of tea from when we were like 5 years old. And it was just a really, you know, there's nobody in the profession that's going to tell you, hopefully, that you shouldn't be there, or that, you know, your background kind of holds you back in any way necessarily. But it's definitely communicated sometimes in those types of experiences where you realize that your upbringing or whatever is slightly out of step with everyone else's kind of experience. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Emma Morris, Dr. Emma Morris, who's going to chat to us a wee bit about her experiences. And Ian, any questions or anything, feel free to throw them into the chat as we go along. Thanks, Emma. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Hopefully everyone can hear me. This is the weird and wonderful thing about doing this, is that no one can tell whether you can hear me. Yes, I got a thumbs up. Brilliant. Thanks, Liam. Okay, so I thought that I'd just give a bit of a chronological kind of timeline, really, as to just my experience. I think in terms of class and sort of privilege in terms of social class wasn't necessarily something that had kind of been as apparent to me until I got on training. I think I just kind of had a lot of acceptance of, oh, this is just what life's like. And then when I got on training, it was like, oh, this isn't quite what things are like. So I feel like I've been on quite a journey in that, and just to kind of link into what's been said before about that kind of shame and guilt and that kind of not wanting to speak about your upbringing. I certainly was at that point when I started training, but now I'm a lot more confident in that. So that's, otherwise I wouldn't have been here tonight. So I trained at Liverpool. I started in 2016, qualified in 2019. So just coming up to 1 year post qualification, which sounds bizarre. I was brought up in Wigan, which is a very, very working class town in South Lancashire. The borough itself is a pretty deprived borough, and I lived on one of the biggest council estates in that borough. In a way, my upbringing was your typical kind of experience there, in terms of, you know, we had the local drug dealer living on our street who was always getting arrested, in and out of prison. You know, we'd go around to people's houses, and one day my friend found a packet of cocaine behind a picture frame on the windowsill, and that kind of thing was just, you know, relatively normal. A lot of my friends weren't really bothered about education. Now, I was always encouraged to just try and do my best. And I really think that that encouragement was the thing that actually sort of differentiated me from some of the other friends that I had. So, like, for example, when it came to GCSE time, I was sat in the back garden revising. I was actually being quite focused. I knew that if I revised in my bedroom, I would just watch TV. So I went and sat in the back garden to try and do some revision, and I ended up having stones thrown at me over the fence from the next door neighbour and all my friends because they thought I was a swot for revising. So even then, I guess I felt like I didn't entirely fit in there, just because I'd had that encouragement at home just to try and do my best. And so education wise, I had always been quite focused. I wanted that good education, but I guess what I didn't realise was how I maybe faced some barriers that other people didn't. It just all seemed perfectly normal to me. One of the things that I was really grateful for that actually made a massive difference coming from my background was that I was in the years of when education maintenance allowance, or EMA, was given to people in college, and it was £30 a week from the government for people who came from families with low incomes. And what that meant with, along with that and a part-time job, I could fund myself through college. I could pay for my bus fares, I could pay for my lunches, and I actually had a little bit of spending money to go out with friends and things like that. So actually that EMA made a massive difference. It meant I still had to do a little bit of part-time work, but I didn't have to, you know, really kind of burn the candle at both ends in trying to do full-time college and loads of work. So I was really grateful for that, and that genuinely did make a big difference. When it came down to going to uni, it's really interesting that the discussions come up quite a lot about having a car, because that's absolutely something that was a consideration for me when I was choosing a uni. I thought I either stay living at home, and I was lucky that I was able to do that. My mum was supportive in me doing that, or I use my uni loan to pay for accommodation and I live, you know, in uni and have the proper uni experience. I am generally a pretty sensible person and decided to go with the logic of, no, you need to get a car because you need a job when you finish this course. So my uni loan went on a car, and more so the insurance and the upkeep of it. And I was very lucky that I was attending uni at a time where the fees were just £1,175 a year, which I know now people aren't quite so privileged. So that was really helpful. But what was more helpful for me was, again, being the first person from my family that had attended uni, being from the address that I was at, the parental income that was in the household, meant that actually I got all my university fees paid for me. So that just meant that my loan was mine to spend on that car and for the living costs, in terms of running the car and whatnot, and not a penny of that had to go on fees. So actually I came out of uni with a 10 grand loan, which these days is probably very, very sought after. So I am very grateful. Actually, my background enabled me to not come out of university with like 20-30 grand's worth of debt. And also my age at what time, but the year that I went to uni as well. So I definitely had a few things working for me, which I may well not have done had I been born 5 years later. So did uni. I kind of thought I wanted to pursue a career in clinical psychology, and I knew it was competitive, and I also knew that you needed experience. I didn't know how I was going to get that experience through voluntary work, because I knew that once I finish uni, I'm going to have to get a job because I need to be able to live. And so what I decided to do was do some voluntary work between second and third year when we didn't have lectures. So when you have those long, like 3 or 4 month summers in your undergrad, I was still working part-time as I did all through uni, but also what I then did was do some voluntary work with a couple of different agencies. And that really helped me to get a full-time job as a support worker once I finished uni. And that car was very much needed because that was a condition of the job, because it was an outreach job. So I needed the car. So I felt at the time that was the right decision, even though I do now very much regret missing out on a decent freshers week. So as I was got the support worker job, I knew again I'd probably need a master's. So I looked into a few masters, and there was a part-time one at a local university in research methods, and I thought that sounds perfect. Part-time, I could do that alongside a full-time job, that's going to work, until part-time meant that you still had to go into uni 2 days a week. And I thought, well, I can't do that full-time, so I ended up just getting rid of that because I couldn't do it. So I just thought, well, I'm just never going to get a master's, I just can't do it, so it's not going to be viable. Because at that point I had to move out of my mum. She'd kept me for 21 years. She needed to get rid of me. So I had to stand on my own 2 feet. So started working full time. And then I heard about a job called a graduate mental health worker, which these days it's a psychological wellbeing practitioners in IAPT. And that allowed you to do some a postgrad certificate alongside working. And I thought that's perfect. So maybe I can get some postgrad stuff alongside working. So that was perfect, and I was very lucky to get one of those positions. I never applied for any assistant psychologist jobs because one of the things that scared the life out of me was having a 6-month contract and no stability. I wasn't in a position where I could have a 6-month contract and risk that contract terminating before I'd got a new job. And so I never applied for any assistant psychologist jobs at all because I just couldn't risk it. So I started the graduate mental health worker job, and I was really enjoying it. Struggled quite a bit with the academic side of things. I think one of the things that was spoken a little bit about in the last webinar was just kind of feeling a little bit isolated and doing academic work and not really having that, anyone to proofread your work and to, support you through referencing and just guide you generally through things. And I genuinely felt at that point that that master's level, that postgrad certificate level was my point. I was not good enough to get above that. I barely scraped through that postgrad certificate at 41%. 40% was a pass mark, and I genuinely thought, this is me now, I'm done. There's no way I could do this doctorate. And lucky for me, I was enjoying working in primary care, and IAPT started, and there was a lovely pathway into high intensity therapist, which after 12 months training at a band 6 gave you a band 7 salary. And so I thought, oh, perfect, let's keep doing that. This is easier, definitely easier. So I did that, and after a couple of years I thought, what if I get sick of doing this and I want to do something different? Because don't get me wrong, it's got its benefits working in that job, but also it's quite limited in terms of the scope of work that you do. It's very repetitive. And so I was just thinking, do I want to do this for the next 30 odd years? I'm not sure I do. So I was lucky by that point in that I was self-sufficient enough to be able to fund a master's, and I just APEL'd the credits I'd got from the postgrad diploma from the IAT work onto a master's programme, did the dissertation component of it, and came out with a master's. And that for me was absolutely invaluable, because I don't think I would have got anywhere with training had I not had that master's. And also I felt academically things had clicked a little bit at that point as well, so I was getting better marks, and that then made me start to think, actually, could I do clinical psychology? Am I academically able to do that? I'd managed to get my distinction at a master's. Can I do that now? Maybe I can. So left it for a couple of years and then decided, no, now's the time to apply. But then when I was applying, I thought, well, I can't move. By this point, I had a mortgage. I've got my house. I don't want to sell up, so I was limited to the courses that I applied to. Moving really wasn't an option. But I guess at this point, I didn't necessarily realise that these were huge barriers or huge hurdles that I'd overcome. It was just something that I was generally just doing. It didn't really occur to me that maybe for some people these things were not as big a barriers as they are for others. So when I started training, I guess that was the first time that I'd been around people that perhaps hadn't come from sort of more similar backgrounds to myself. And that really opened my eyes, I guess, to, for some people, the level of privilege that was there, that I guess I'd just never been exposed to. People where families were helping them out financially in huge ways, which really facilitated them to be able to, move to training, or in the past to be able to take up different jobs or to have amazing experiences volunteering and working abroad, doing various things. And I guess I'd just never really seen that. And so the other thing that confused me was how many people were saying that they were working class. And I think something that was saying before about kind of the offending the middle class, And as soon as someone brought up about working class, I always felt as people, yeah, I was too. And in a way, actually, that left me feeling quite invalidated, because for me, listening to some people's experiences, they were a world apart from mine. And I thought, well, what am I then? I'm lost, I'm confused. Felt really invalidated, left me wondering what background I was from. And in a way, up until that point, I think I realised that I was blissfully ignorant of a lot of things. Although I knew that I had these challenges, I didn't really think about them in such a great amount of detail as I have done since starting training. It did certainly add to my reluctance to disclose things, certainly earlier on in training, because I felt that maybe I would be quite judged, or that, you know, obviously I do identify as being in a minority group, but that group was necessarily, it didn't feel quite as important as others. And so I just thought, no, it's just better to stay quiet. I don't want to rock the boat with anything, or just say nothing. And then there was an event relatively early on in training where there was talking about diversity, and made a comment about the lack of diversity within the trainees that were sat there. And that a lot of my people in my cohort then started talking about the more hidden diversity that you don't always see. And that's what made me start to become a little bit more confident in saying, actually, yeah, I identify with that as well. So I was really lucky to have those people in my cohort, and I genuinely think without people being quite as vocal about that right from the early stages, I certainly wouldn't be talking as openly as I am today, because I would have still felt a lot of that shame side of things. One of the things that's been mentioned tonight is kind of having your foot in two camps. Again, I can completely identify that with that. And I don't know if anybody's noticed Jason Manford, but his last tour was called Muddle Class. And I thought, oh my God, that's me, muddle class. Here I am, feeling like I'm completely working class. And I was sat there today having scrambled eggs with chives on it, wondering what on earth I'm doing. So that muddle class to me just really, really conceptualizes how I feel in myself. I feel very much working class, but I'm in amongst this middle class thing. I'm earning a good salary. I have my own house. I have a car. I have holidays. And that's just so those two things are so incongruent with each other. And it's really weird navigating that. So I think the experience of training has left me much more aware of the issues with class, and I guess opened my eyes a little bit to, as a qualified psychologist, how I might be able to influence how things move in terms of that, you know, trying to get more working class people into the profession. And one of the things that I personally thought of was that I would never take an honorary assistant psychologist on. Because for me, not everybody's in that position where they're able to do voluntary work. And I think it would be, you know, for me, it would just feel completely at odds with my upbringing if I was happy to take on honorary APs. I would always, if ever I was in a position to be recruiting assistant psychologists, I would try and make them permanent posts, because not a lot of people would want to take a 6-month contract. I was one of those too fearful of taking a 6-month contract just in case it didn't, you know, I didn't get something else at the end of it. I would definitely encourage people at undergrad level, if they're wanting to go into clinical psychology, to utilise that summer holiday, because I definitely felt that that was helpful for me. And not something that I heard of a lot of people doing. And I do feel extremely lucky that I managed to do that, because I think that really helped me to get my foot on the ladder job-wise, albeit in a minimum wage support worker job. But nonetheless, that was the first step on the ladder, and that got me to where I needed to be. So that was so useful. And I think as well, some courses do place a lot of emphasis on having postgrad qualification. And I think just echoing what people have said before is just really looking at the courses that you can apply to, and looking at your experience, your qualifications, and where that is a good match to, because everywhere is so different. One of the things that Will mentioned last time was about the benefits of kind of coming from that working class background. One of the things for me personally, like I've mentioned, only having a £10,000 university loan, which that's, you know, that's not bad. And amazingly now that is paid off. I've been in a position now to get rid of that. So I feel very fortunate to have gone all the way through to doctorate level with no university debt. And genuinely, I think if it wasn't for my background, I don't think I would be in that position to be able to say that. So I am so grateful for that. Working in my service, so I work in a later life service, and it's a lot of people from a working class background, and it's in Wigan where I live. So it's great being able to just have a chat with people and just talk in normal slang, which Wigan slang's great if you don't know it, and just have that you know, bit of a rapport with people. And I've loved that, and I've really liked being working back in Wigan, and just being more confident to be myself, which I wasn't when, you know, pre-clinical training. So having that confidence with some clients has really helped our rapport, and I've been really grateful to that. And I also think another benefit of having that background is just being in a position now to try and give a voice for those people, and try to, like was being mentioned before, try and just kind of influence how things can be, just to give everybody as equal an opportunity as possible, and so that this career isn't out of reach for people, so that it is achievable. So I think that's the main points that I've got. Like I say, just emphasise that middle class again, because that to me, just that spoke to me a lot. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions if anyone has them. Thanks for listening.
So much. We're going to jump over to Liam in a wee second, but I just want to say, first of all, fuming, you've cleared your student loan.
Ben.
Few steps away from getting you audited by the tax office, because I think that's very unfair. So Liam, will we jump over to you, and then we'll take some questions at the end?
Lovely. So good evening, everyone. My name's Liam. I'm a clinical psychologist currently working in Suffolk. I work in a youth service, which is essentially a community mental health team for young people aged 14 to 25. I went to the University of East Anglia, and I graduated in 2015. So I'm just coming up to 5 years qualified, which makes me feel really quite old. I just want to start by really thanking Will and Ben for the opportunity to have this space to talk about this, because I think taking the opportunity to reflect on my experiences, a big feature that was coming through was the opportunity to have working class role models throughout my journey, and having people who sounded like me, had similar experiences, shared my values. That some hard work, a lot of luck has really kind of kept me on the path. And I suppose if you want to think about how class issues are still really, you know, quite valid and important in this day and age, you only have to look at, you know, recent social media. You know, Jack Monroe talking this morning about David Walliams' books and how there's a lot of very kind of classist language in it. You know, it's something that is really quite important. So I was born and raised in a town called Luton, which, if you are not aware of it, is a post-industrial town in Bedfordshire. It's typically the punchline for a lot of jokes, but it's also a town that has had a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, a lot of adversity, and at times it's been a real reflection of many of the social issues that are going on in the country and society. And I think it's a place where you would really struggle to escape from the impact of those factors if you grew up there. And I think it's definitely impacted on the way I've come to view the world, the way I kind of practice in my career. It runs through me like a stick of rock, really. Kind of aligned with that is I'm a second generation immigrant, is the kind of term I think is used to describe it. My dad is Irish, and I think similar to everyone here, in fact, I am the first to attend university. Everyone else in my family are tradesmen, they're bricklayers, electricians, carpenters. And obviously growing up, that means there's no exposure to that kind of professional class of people. I think very early on, I'm lucky enough to be, I think, quite bright and quite academic, and my dad kind of cottoned on to the fact I'm probably not going to be hod carrying and lifting bricks on site anytime soon. And I think there are a lot of values that have kind of been pushed into me around doing better than the last generation did, of kind of really working hard. And there's a really strong work ethic that comes from my family around the kind of, first one in, last one out, kind of throw your full effort in. And again, reflecting a lot on my journey, it's really clear that that's kind of running throughout. I'm really fortunate that my family have been incredibly supportive, and more supportive than I have been aware of a lot of the time. My family were able to help out in a lot of ways that others who have not been as fortunate about. But I've found out in more recent years that there was a great cost to that. I found out my family were putting themselves into a lot of debt or taking on a lot of those costs themselves to kind of push me along. And I think what really kind of taps into that for me is that kind of pushing me into helping me in a career where they don't really understand it and still really don't. So my dad kind of understood my job when I worked in a memory clinic with older people. He could understand dementia. Less so about kind of general mental health in a youth population. So again, it's interesting how the work we do sometimes doesn't easily translate to those populations. So growing up in Luton, a lot of my mates were, very similar to me. Everyone was kind of in the same boat, so class didn't really kind of clash as much for me growing up. I was, lucky enough to go to Luton sixth form, and again, everyone was in the same boat. But when I went to university, that's where class really kind of rubbed together. I went to a Russell Group university, so full of kind of people from a very affluent and middle class background, and we laugh about it now, and it's a joke that I've kind of claimed for myself, but you may have already noticed that people from Luton will put a glottal stop on the T in the middle of words. Okay, I say Luton, not Luton. And that leads to entertaining stuff like trying to pronounce Brita water filter. And internet, get us a glass of water. And I've really claimed that I kind of play into that. And sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback. And I think we'll talk more about accents later, because they definitely kind of come up a lot in my story, but there's definitely something about the kind of need to be a social chameleon in my life and my journey. The idea of going to uni and kind of over the 10-12 weeks of term poshing up and gaining a T and kind of adapting your language to then go home to Luton and the holidays, and all your mates mock you for being posh, and so you kind of posh down, and then you go back to uni and they mock you for so there's a lot of kind of social adaptation. I was quite lucky to find out about clinical psychology quite early on. When I went to sixth form, I did psychology because it sounded interesting, and we were doing an abnormal psychology module, and we learned about schizophrenia and psychosis, and just fascinated with this world. So I kind of got a bit stuck in, read up a lot about it, was lucky enough to catch a couple of breaks at uni. So I approached PhD students and asked them if they needed a research assistant to collect some data. So that's something I would really recommend people, kind of those little opportunities like that. Managed to get a small grant to do a research project over one of the summers, which paid for my accommodation over the summer, so saved a little bit of money there. On an interesting note, and I'm happy to talk about this and what I took from this, I was someone who worked in an honorary assistant psychologist position over my third year and a little bit into a later master's. I think it's definitely something I'm quite conflicted about. I'm not someone who would necessarily ban them, but I would want them very heavily regulated and kind of changed really quite extensively. But what that post gave me was the kind of access to a supervisor who was himself from a kind of working class position, and going from a university with very middle class academics to a clinical position where someone who was quite normal and kind of very similar to me was really it kind of helped keep me on the line that this was a career that I could do. You know, there were people like me in this career as well. I was able to do a master's degree, but like a lot of people here, obviously, I didn't have the funding, and I only managed to get funding to do my master's because my granddad died, and he left me a small amount of money, which was just about enough to cover the master's. And I think through a lot of my time, there's been a real sense of kind of sacrificing, you know, for the kind of the longer term goal. You know, in my honorary assistant psychologist position, you know, in order to afford the bus fare to get to the honorary assistant position, I would eat less during the week, and I'd save up the money to get enough for a return ticket. There'd be days where I fell asleep on the bus because I was too tired coming back, and I'd end up at bus stations. You know, and a lot of that through university as well. And again, seeing your mates with full fridges, whereas you're on the kind of frozen vegetables and the kind of cheap stuff. That's where that stuff kind of really tends to show itself. After that, I think because my honorary assistant post was in a neuro rehab, I was again fortunate enough to get a assistant psychologist job, and very similar to others, it was an assistant psychologist job back near where my parents lived. It came up. It was just one of those lovely kind of sliding door moments where it just kind of appeared as I was leaving. Managed to get an interview. You know, went and bought a shirt from Debenhams and some smart trousers. You know, got to look the part. You got to kind of put on the uniform, and managed to kind of get the position. And definitely told them that I had a car, and yeah, I could start in a couple of weeks' time, and that'd be no problem. And then they offered me the job, and then I told my parents that I needed a car. I'd been lucky enough to get, you know, I got my driving lessons kind of done before I went to uni, but that was a fun conversation of, well, hey, congratulations, you got a job. You need what now? So scraping together kind of money from part-time jobs, borrowing a little bit of money off family members, got myself my little kind of Peugeot 206. And I think working in that post, again, there were a good couple of times where class became very, very apparent. The pronunciation of words in neuropsychological assessments, or those of you who work in neuro rehab are aware of that, there are tests like the WATAR and the TOF, which are pronunciation tests to kind of determine premorbid intelligence from a reading test. I took the pronunciation sheet home, and having to practice to try and overcome your own accent to make sure you sound like the test sounds is really quite an interesting kind of reflection to sit with. There's also, I think, reflecting a lot on what people have said around internalized stigma around feeling that I needed to hide my accent when working with older people, because there was the sense that I wouldn't be took seriously, or that it's, you know, I wouldn't sound as polite. And someone mentioned it earlier, kind of smoothing the edges off yourself. And I think that's something that's really, I'm coming to terms with a lot of my life. I think I've tried to smooth the edges off who I am to try and fit a preconceived notion of who you should be as a psychologist. I think one of the situations where I don't think I've ever felt so uncomfortable in my life and really kind of class clashing was attending a leaving do of a staff member in the kind of psychology team and mental health team. And we went to a tapas bar. Now, I'd never had tapas growing up. We were a bit of meat and two veg family. The kind of dolmio from the jar was a bit fancy. And being surrounded by people who were talking about how wonderful this dish was on their gap year and how they were throwing recommendations at each other. And I remember looking at the menu and not being able to understand a single word. And the absolute fear and my stomach dropping at the bottom of me as the waiter approached and I had my psychology, my supervisor, her boss, the consultant, the head of service, and I was just staring at this menu and just over and over again, just not understanding a single word on it. And I think that was a really kind of interesting experience for me about the experiences we have and just being so aware of that stuff. Interestingly, just kind of on reflecting on what a few others have said, when I got to university, just so I don't forget, having a strange conversation as to why someone would want a steering lock on their car, and not being able to understand why you need a steering lock. And, growing up in Luton, you kind of need a steering lock, otherwise someone's having your car. I was, after that, fortunate enough to do an assistant psychologist post working in expert witness work for someone who worked for the family courts. So having to apply an assessment lens to families who were really struggling. And one of the first things I took to supervision, and something that I battled throughout, was we were having to try and understand families who was, really apply that kind of lens to families to houses which were very reminiscent of many of my friends growing up. So even the idea of not having a duvet on your bed, or, there being dog mess in the garden. And, I think similar to some of the stuff Jay talks about, that being considered as to whether or not that's neglectful needs to be brought up about. But knowing that there were a couple of times in my childhood where games of football got stopped because the ball suddenly got very disgusting and needed to be kind of rinsed off with the hose. So again, just very interesting about the assumptions we make. And that's something I've just, how do you tie your experiences whilst having to apply that lens is quite interesting. After that, I applied for the doctorate 3 or 4 times, got on at UEA, was very fortunate that a lot of the people in my cohort were very grounded, from kind of working class backgrounds or very kind of close to that. So my cohort felt very safe. It's interesting because I think what I would like to kind of add into this mix is a bit of a reflection on the last 5 years of qualified life. Imposter syndrome is something that is inherent in what we do. And I think for me, there is something around never feeling that I quite fit in clinical psychology that I'm going to have to be straddling for the rest of my career. And I think Emma said it beautifully with the kind of middle class stuff, but I feel very, very comfortable with nurses and social workers and people like that. What I've often found is I feel very isolated and alone when I'm in psychology meetings, because I often look around the table and I just does not feel that there kind of people who are like me. I felt the same at BPS conferences and stuff like that when conversations come up about people's lives and it just doesn't kind of click with me. So it's something that interestingly doesn't go away. And there are often times where I worry if I did the right thing, if I'd be better in a different position. But over the last couple of years, have become much more confident in just kind of sitting with that uncertainty and just recognizing that in a way that uncertainty and that discomfort pushes me a little bit towards being the clinician that I want to be. And there is something around being working class is an advantage. So a couple of people have mentioned this in the chat already. The story that always really comes to my mind is a young person I was working with who'd worked with a couple of psychologists before, and in the first kind of sentence or two of me introducing who I was and talking the way I do, because I proudly wear my accent now, she just went, "Oh, thank fuck, you sound normal." And that's no criticism of the people that came before, but I think there is something around sounding a little bit like you do that helps bridge that divide, that builds that initial rapport. It's something I've had a lot of feedback about, that apparently people find it easier to build a rapport with me, that I seem more down to earth, that I don't seem like a snob. the interesting thing I have, and I'd be interested to see if anyone else in the chat or in the group holds this, is the kind of idea of your doctor title. It really sits uncomfortably with me, and I wear it and I use it because I've earned it, and I think it's important that I do so. But sometimes there is just that real, it doesn't quite kind of mesh with who I feel I am, and I don't know if that's just that kind of middle class thing of just it's something that I'll get used to. I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on, and it's a statement that came up a lot, of why I worked as hard as I did and why I really kept pushing, and people have alluded to it as well, is for me, it felt like there was so much farther for me to fall if I failed, because I didn't have the kind of support that others did, or I didn't have the backup plan. This was kind of it. And so it has meant that my journey has felt very kind of critical and very pressured at times. But I'm someone who quite proudly wears the working class accent now. I'm really keen to try and get people into the career from a working class background. There is definitely something around hooking people in earlier, getting people aware of this, and giving people hope that it's something that they can kind of get into as well. It's, it is for them. So I'm just really thankful these kind of spaces. I'm aware I've prattled on for a little bit, so I'm gonna stop myself from talking now and kind of open it up to questions and reflections, and I'd love to hear them.
Liam, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think it's interesting you talk about like there being further to fall, because that's Elenia earlier said something about it, being quite high stakes, it feeling very much like you're going to pursue this career path, but the drop to which you can fall on either side of the hurdles feels huge. You can feel like, and interesting what Emma said about she chose kind of a career path that offered the most stability and offered kind of consistency and a bit of reassurance that you'll be paid beyond 6 months, which I think is really it's all kind of part of that wider thing of looking for a bit of security, I suppose, in a field that doesn't always feel maybe like you fit, or that just it doesn't always feel as stable maybe as your family imagine. Because I think definitely from my experience, my family think that I'm like a millionaire now, and I don't know, just want to bite and love life, but they really don't. They don't have a notion, but it feels so beyond like kind of what I grew up with. And I think that feeling of that doctor title, it does sit uncomfortably, and I think that this whole thing just seems like a world away from everything that I grew up with. So I still from time to time think like, what the fuck is what's going on? So I just wanted to open up to any questions. So I think if there's been a few really, really interesting things. I think one of the things that has consistently kind of come up this evening and in the last session was about accents. And I'd be interested, seeing as you both are people who have accents, interested from hearing from you in terms of, Liam, you've kind of spoken about this a little bit, but for you, Emma, as well, like, have you ever found that your accent has maybe gotten in the way or has been a bonus, or I don't know, have you ever been conscious of it, I suppose?
I started being conscious of my accent at college because my accent's quite sort of Lancashire. And at college, I went to college in Manchester. And although people probably don't think there's much of a difference in accents, there is. And one of the things my friends used to say is, oh, you're going to go home and get a can of Coke and walk through the door. And I honestly didn't really think I had an accent until I went to college in Manchester. And then all of a sudden I got really paranoid that I go door and talk. So I think for me from then, I don't know. In a way, I don't even know what my accent is anymore. It depends who I'm with. If I'm with people like who I knew from when I was younger, my accent just comes straight out when I'm around people that speak in the same way. Whereas I'm very conscious that, it probably doesn't sound that way at other times. And I think I've definitely softened a lot. I think, Liam, like you're saying about kind of adjusting your accent a little bit just to like tone it a little bit and make it a bit more neutral. I definitely feel like I've done that. I feel like I'm at the point now where I just don't know when I'm doing it. So yeah, I guess for me, you just don't know what you're going to get. But I don't think mine's that strong that it's made a particular difference. And I think for me, I've always worked in the area that's got a similar accent. So it's not really been, I guess if I was maybe working down in London or in the Northeast or like in Northern Ireland, it would probably stand out a mile. But for me, I just don't feel like it's been a huge difference for me in that sense.
Yeah. And Liam, for you, so you kind of mentioned that you had kind of maybe adjusted your accent, you know, when you're doing like the top off or whatever. Interesting that that's called the TOEFL, isn't it? But, you know, when you're doing those kind of like neuropsych assessments, and I suppose from my own experience doing that kind of stuff, sometimes it's actually been really helpful to kind of build a bit of connection with people when you're pronouncing things, you know, even with an Irish accent, you know, pronouncing things, but just in a colloquial way versus in the very standardized kind of eugenics way that Pearson would like us to.
Yes, I think it's especially on the kind of when my supervisor drilled into me that you kind of have to pronounce them exactly as they are for the validity of the test, you know. Telling the story about going out, and I can't even remember the story, it's been pretty drilled into my brain somewhere, but you know, going out, he got the rain, whatever, and stayed and watched a football match, you know, feeling the kind of the need to pronounce that in the kind of Queen's English, you know. So you're having your neuropsych voice, you know, we talked about having a telephone voice, so having your neuro voice, kind of it felt like at times. Yeah.
I am going to show you some blocks. They are red on one side and white on the other. I'm just really enunciating every vowel. Like, yeah.
This side they're red, on this side they're white.
And there was something really nice. I think it was you, Liam, that talked about going kind of from being in academia to being kind of in the real world and actually getting to apply some kind of professional experience with a professional who maybe reflected your background a little bit more. And that was something I think we talked about in the last webinar where I talked about it, but just that thing of like going for, that was the thing for me definitely that cemented my interest in this career, because I think through undergrad and kind of the early stages of going for a master's, you don't often see yourself reflected in the type of circles that you kind of navigate through. And I think, Emma, it was really interesting to hear you say that about, you know, it was you kind of navigated that through training, you know, which is really interesting. You know, that it didn't become apparent for you until you were kind of midway. And I just wondered, I suppose, for both of you, kind of what was, because we're talking about the value of kind of role models and stuff, and for both of you, I suppose, what was it like to be able to find that at different points in your careers? Don't all speak at once.
Shall I go first?
Go on, Liam. Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, in the assistant journey, when I was the honorary assistant psychologist, it kind of gave a little bit of confirmation that I could do this. So I think it gave that little bit of confidence to say, okay, you could manage this, kind of stay on course. Someone I didn't mention, and someone who has been a kind of big influence on me has been my kind of the consultant who was supervising me for the last couple of years of my job. Again, from a working class background, very relatable, and kind of we always joked she was the person I wanted to be when I grew up. And so I think having someone who reflects your values and gives you something to aspire to and to kind of mold yourself towards has been really quite helpful. I think we talk a lot at the kind of this stage of assistants and trainees of kind of, you know, trying to make yourself what a trainee psychologist should look like, as if there is a prototype. It happens at qualified level as well, I believe, and it's nice having someone who doesn't quite fit the mold or doesn't have that same, just someone who it's easier for you to kind of follow and be inspired by, I think.
Yeah, definitely. There's a really nice comment here from Sarah, just asking, like, how can you be more authentic in a way that feels safe? She's an assistant psychologist, and she says there's kind of a lot of pressure to be a certain way, and I think that probably ties in with a lot of the conversations we've had this evening. So I suppose, and also Liam, you're a role model to Sarah, just so you know.
Thanks, Sarah.
That's a good question, maybe for both of you. You know, feeling, I suppose for you, Emma, you navigated this kind of realization through training, and then for Liam, it came a wee bit earlier. But I suppose, what has it felt like balancing kind of authenticity with keeping things safe? Because I suppose you don't want to come, you know, you don't. I think, Emma, you said that you don't want to rock the boat necessarily.
Yeah, I think I've just found it quite difficult in that it's class as a minority group within the profession doesn't seem to be spoken about as much, and so I think it's felt quite difficult for me to be myself and be honest about it, because it's just not I guess that platform for dialogue hasn't been there, and I think this is a great opportunity for that. I think Will's done great with getting these up and running, because I think it does give that platform for those discussions to take place. And like I say, I don't think I kind of realised a lot of sort of some of the barriers that I'd had. And what I also appreciate, I've had a lot of things that other people have had as barriers, so, and they've not been a barrier to me. I guess everybody's journey is completely different. So I think for me, in terms of navigating that safely, it felt safe in terms of just meeting a few people who were more confident. Look at you, Ben, smiling. Ben knows he's one of those people.
I did. That's true. Yeah. You said that. You said that.
But just meeting some people that were a little bit more confident within, I guess within their own skin with regards to the sort of social class background. And that's definitely helped me to, I guess, just kind of have that confidence that I'm not on my own about this, with this. There's lots of other people in the same position. But that said, I still didn't feel safe in doing that on most placements. I think there was only one placement where I actually had those sorts of discussions with my supervisor out of 6 placements. So I guess in one sense, training definitely helps, but then there is still something about something feeling safe in order to do that.
Yep. What about you, Liam?
I think I would agree with that. And I think there are definitely courses which are much more open to these reflections and putting these kind of identities front and center. I think if I was being quite critical of the profession, it's still really quite a conservative and kind of narrow profession still. So my view would be kind of similar to some of the advice from earlier, which is if you kind of go into your application form talking about how you're going to do a Marxist overthrow of clinical psychology, it's kind of really not going to be tolerated. If that's your plan, I would really, really recommend hiding that until you kind of get through into qualified life, where there's a little bit more safety to kind of be yourself. I think I'd share some of the concerns with Emma that, and this is a power dynamic I name with my trainees when I have them, so I'm a supervisor as well, which is I have the power to fail a placement for someone, and you can't help it that power dynamic exists. There is going to be an element of having to live up to the expectations of the supervisor. So I think being qualified and being in a safe service, as Emma said, has given me the room to be more comfortable with who I am, and my hope is that I'm not aiming to be a leader or anything like that, but at least some visibility will kind of help kind of draw these ideas downwards. I think it's, you do what you can to get through, but you may want to express those other, there are alternative organizations where you can really kind of lean on those values. So like Psychologists for Social Change and stuff like that. Really good way of potentially getting involved with that. Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think it's the profession is slowly moving in the right direction, but I think it's just being mindful of what you're applying for, which is a doctoral course to be a clinician in the NHS, and just being mindful of that.
Yeah, because it's an interesting thing there, kind of about finding your tribe. Finding your kind of taking your time to find the peers that are going to support you. I'm really conscious of time, and Monica Geller has just texted me to tell me to hurry up. So I'm just wondering if the rest of the panel can maybe pop back, and we can just do a few kind of final closing up, just reflections. So if we
I would just like to add, Monica Geller is a very popular character and is very praised and thought of.
The best friend, absolutely.
Best organizational skills.
Someone has to do it. Have we got Jade?
Yeah, I'm here. Just avoiding the camera so I don't get kicked off again.
That's a good choice. So I suppose just as a group, if anyone has kind of any reflections just on the chat this evening, that'd be really useful. And Will, if you have noticed any pertinent questions that have come up, that'd be really good too.
I think I've been keeping an eye on a lot of the comments, and I think there's, as always, I think some really nice questions and comments. But I think the one that Melissa's just kind of put in the chat is worth us saying something about. I think I'm not going to attempt to read the whole thing, but I think there's something really important for us to say about the intersection between class and other areas of difference. And I know a few people tonight have alluded to that and touched on it, but I'm going to throw that over to the panel in terms of any thoughts on that.
I do, if that's all right, if I can jump in. I guess my concern about, obviously I was really excited about doing this event and having space to talk about class, because I do think it's not spoken about enough. But I think clinical psychology has a, a well-publicized race issue as well. And I do think that race and class really do go hand in hand, but also, the other social graces as well, things about ability, things about gender, having more barriers if you're a certain gender and a certain class and a certain race versus being, I don't know, different subsets or different combinations of those things. And I think we need to get better at discussing those things quite holistically. And I think, if I think about my own experience, there's been hardships, sure, and a lot of them relate to class and things like that, and a few relate to gender, but I've got the privilege of not having any hardship based on what I look like or the colour of my skin, especially being in, a really ethnically homogenous part of the UK, in North Wales and the Northwest. And so I think we need to maybe be careful about making the term working class mean white working class. I think there's a lot of people that I desperately do not want to exclude. And I think, working classes, like I said before, are not a homogenous group. There's lots of people that make up this group. And I think, not to sound too socialist about it, but we are stronger together. And I think, making those links and knowing that there's not one way to be working class, and that the intersections are important and do, there are mitigating factors and things that do impact on our experiences. But yeah, I think it's really, really important to kind of caveat our experiences and to make sure that working class doesn't become synonymous with white working class, I think is the main point that I'd like to get across.
I think I'd like to just echo a lot of what you've said there, and certainly for me, I guess over the last few weeks, with the BLM movement, it's made me sort of reflect a lot on my white privilege, which I've maybe not reflected on to the same extent as I have over this last few weeks. And I'm really grateful for that movement, actually, to sort of bring that to the forefront of my attention, because it's not necessarily always been there, and I'm glad now that it is. And I guess, like you was just saying, yes, there's been hardships, but I feel massively privileged that I haven't had to have this similar hardships, but have a colour of skin that would create such a huge amount of discrimination as well. So yeah, I do feel very privileged in some ways, although there's been some adversity. And completely agree that it's not just, working class should incorporate everybody from, every race, gender, religion, ethnicity, all of those other, areas of diversity, and definitely agree better together rather than, doing this all separately.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That's
Can I just say one quick thing about that, just to be kind of explicit about it, really, because there's been quite a few tweets about I guess this is a topic and it's something we've been thinking quite a bit about. So obviously very mindful that everybody speaking today and everyone who spoke at the last webinar is white, and I think we are actively trying everything we can to try and kind of get as many different voices, people from as many different types of backgrounds as we can. The challenge is that there aren't that many people from minority backgrounds working as clinical psychologists, and that's a problem for the profession as a whole. So we certainly are trying to get in touch with different groups, are trying to make active efforts to be as kind of inclusive and diverse as we possibly can. If you're sat in the audience and you know of somebody or you want to get involved yourself, do feel free to email me, because I think I'd be very, we're very keen to do whatever we can to make sure that we're hearing from people who can talk to these things. You know, I at the end of the day, as others have kind of alluded to, you know, I can only speak to my own experience and the things that I know about. I wouldn't try and talk about anything that I didn't have direct experience of. So I just wanted to sort of again be explicit and say that that's something we are thinking of and trying to resolve as part of this, as part of making this a useful space for people.
Yeah, I think the psychologists that I know that are from Black, Asian, minority backgrounds are, a lot of them are volunteering to do webinars like this to encourage people from those backgrounds. So kind of taking a slightly different angle. And I guess there's a lot of crossover between the two. So it's interesting the kind of white working class issue gets brought up as kind of it being the sole identity. But actually, if we look at who the working class is, like proportionally, probably more people from ethnic minorities are more likely to be working class than they are middle class because of the kind of systemic disadvantages and oppression and racism and stuff like that. So it is something we kind of need to consider and think about in terms of the intersections more. But it is difficult because those people are underrepresented in the profession. So having the voices here is quite difficult. But I'd encourage people to think about the different aspects of their identity and what they bring and celebrating those different things as well.
I think somebody mentioned like a Marxist overthrow of psychology, and while we're not advocating that necessarily, I think it's interesting to pull together that, you know, that thread of kind of social injustice, but also just economic deprivation. It affects, you know, some minorities much more than others, and it's something I think everyone today has kind of talked about. You know, it's obviously there's all the other kind of systemic stuff, but very practically, if you can't get a job because you don't have a car, you know, that's a huge barrier. And I think that's something that's common to definitely all of our experience from the last couple of webinars, and I think that's something that I'd say a lot of us will have in common. I think, you know, we might not be able to do a Marxist overthrow anytime soon, but I think it's really, really good and really valuable to be naming these things and just have a space to name all this stuff, where maybe before it sounded like a lot of us kind of felt quite isolated with it, and the narratives felt just very personal and felt like our own. And I think what I found really, really useful from the past couple of webinars has just been hearing that, wow, I'm not, you know, this working class hero that I thought I was necessarily. It's actually lovely to hear that, you know, the things I've experienced have been shared by other people, which has been lovely. And I think this, if that is all that is at the moment, you know, just the space to name all that kind of stuff, and I suppose name some of that inequality, I think that's really, really, really useful and really helpful. And hopefully there's loads of room to grow with that as well.
Okay, that feels like probably quite a nice point to bring us to a close on. Unless any of our facilitators have got any final pearls of wisdom or anything they would like to say.
Don't give up. Just the profession needs people who've had the experiences that we have and you have. You know, just it's tough. You're carrying a heavier burden than many others. You know, you'll be carrying different burdens. Just, you know, don't give up if you can.
Definitely.
Join us. You can make the profession better. We need that recruitment poster for like the army.
Their accents are all messed up, but you know, it's fine. We'll find a common language somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's bring this to a close. Thank you, firstly, to our fantastic facilitators, all wonderful. Really appreciate all of your energy and thoughts and reflections and honesty. So on behalf of everybody watching, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who is tuning in live and has chipped in with good questions, good comments. I think it's really, really lovely to see people engaging with the things we're talking about. I hope it's useful. And thank you if you're watching this at a later date as well. Thank you to you as well. We will be sending round via email a sort of feedback questionnaire. So if you've watched it live, you'll probably get that in your email. If you watch it on YouTube, I'll put a link in the description. Please do fill that in for a couple of reasons, partly because we want people to be able to have input into these and to tell us what's been useful, tell us what's helpful so we can do more of it, tell us what more you want so that we can do that as well. And we're also trying to think about what other projects we can look into getting off the ground on this theme. So if you've got ideas, if you've got suggestions, if you've got people for us to speak to, organisations for us to be put in touch with, we're very keen for this to be a collaborative thing. We definitely don't have all the answers. So that feedback questionnaire will be sent around, or you can get in touch with us by email as well at beyondthetherapyroom@gmail.com. I think that's it from me. I'm going to look meaningfully at everybody else. Anything else to say, guys?
No, that's it.
Just a quick thank you to you both for making these sessions happen. Yeah, really nice to have the space to think about it and connect with other people with similar and different experiences. It's been really nice to hear that and have it hosted, so thank you.
No problem. Okay, thank you everyone. See you next time.
Bye.